Welcome back to the Bookly Podcast, where this week's book is The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Now, right off the bat, I want to say I'm not a huge fan of clickbaity titles, but I had to throw one in on this one because I'm trying to play the YouTube algorithm a little bit and get used to this whole thing. I generally just make the name of the book the title of my podcast episode, so I'm not used to this whole thing, but I am honestly curious to know how many people are in favor of trying communism again, and how many people think that we have enough concrete evidence from history that there's no reason that we should ever repeat it once again, and that we should just throw that one out as something that's never going to work. The Gulag Archipelago stands as a testament to the pitfalls of authoritarianism, totalitarianism, as well as communism. A lot of isms right there in general. And Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn did not hold back or hold any punches when he described both the consequences as well as his own personal feelings on what happened to the Soviet Union during the reign of communism. Now, I will admit right off the bat, I did not read the 3-volume version of the Gulag Archipelago. It is, one, really, really long, but two, I also just don't have a very firm grasp on Russian history, and the author stated that the abridged version was actually made for a Western audience. So the abridged version of this book was made for people who maybe don't have a firm grasp of the history, but also people who can't digest 2,000 plus pages of Gulag history as well as Russian history and are looking for something a little bit more palatable. So for the podcast, I chose the abridged version. Also, it's a little bit hard for me to read a 2,000-page, 3-volume book in the course of a week. Maybe sometime in my life, I'll get to reading the entire thing. I actually really enjoyed this book, so I can see myself going back and trying to read all 3 volumes at some point. But for the purpose of the podcast, this is all about the abridged version of this book. Now, at the beginning of the abridged version, there is an editor's note from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. And I just wanted to go ahead and read it directly because I think that it really encapsulates why I view this book as such an important book. If it were possible for any nation to fathom another people's bitter experiences through a book, how much easier its future fate would become and how many calamities and mistakes it could avoid. But it is very difficult. There always is this fallacious belief it would not be the same here. Here, such things are impossible. Alas, all evil of the 20th century is possible everywhere on earth. I believe that there's some sort of saying, I've heard it on a podcast somewhere, I'm sure I'm going to butcher it, but it is, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. That is, in essence, what is so important about this book. The Gulag was horrific. The stories in this book are absolutely horrific, and it's kind of hard to stomach a lot of this book. However, it is so important that we read books about the horrific things throughout history, whether it's this book, whether it's the rise and fall of the Third Reich, whether it's books about the Civil War, whether it's books about anywhere around the world where horrific acts were done. It's important that we understand how those people got to that place. Because without understanding the how, then there's no way for us to prevent that in the future. And honestly, I don't know that I 100% believed that for a really long time. I always just kind of thought like this is going to sound really dumb, but that we were more evolved than that we had just become better as a society, and that we were past some of these horrific things that we read about in history books. However, I really don't think that's true anymore. And I think that was really well illustrated to me actually after I read this book. So usually after I read a book, I go to Reddit and I go to Goodreads and I just try to learn what other people thought about the book. I like to get a different perspective from other people, especially when on my podcast, I'm not having a guest on for that day. And I went to Goodreads to look at the 1-star reviews for this book. And the first review at the very top of Goodreads was a review that just said that, in essence, this is anti-communist propaganda. And the source that they cited was a blog called In Defense of Communism, a Marxist-Leninist blog. I mean, do we really have entire blogs set up nowadays in defense of Vladimir Lenin. Like, that's crazy to me that we have entire blogs that are set up in defense of communism when the actual fruits of communism can be read in books like the Gulag Archipelago, and it can also be seen and heard from in people who are currently fleeing out of countries like Cuba, and we can actually hear what communism was like for them. Now, I'm sure that there's always the argument, well, we haven't done communism right. And that argument was definitely made when I went searching for what people thought about this book on Reddit. So I ended up on a Reddit thread where people were basically saying that the United States is just as bad, if not worse, than communist Soviet Union was back in the day. And just for perspective, I found myself on this Reddit thread probably an hour after finishing the Gulag Archipelago. So this was all still pretty fresh on my mind, and I can promise you that if 1/10 of the stuff in the Gulag Archipelago is true, then the United States is nowhere close to as bad as communist Russia was during this time period from 1916 to 1968. And that just goes to show that if we don't take the time to read books like the Gulag Archipelago or like The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that we really will grow up not learning the lessons that we should have from these events, and eventually we can fall prey to those same exact tactics to be used to us. And who knows, we may find ourselves in similar situations. And I really do hate if-then statements. I hate the argument that if we don't read this book, then we're going to end up with gulags in the United States, and we're going to end up shipping people up to Alaska to work on these forced labor camps. However, if we don't learn from our mistakes, how are we to avoid those same mistakes in the future? Now, it might not look exactly the same as communist Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, but the result has always been a totalitarian regime that hurts the citizens of its country. And that's just my experience from my studies about history and the books that I've read. But if you have any other ideas or any other perspectives from things that you've read, please mention them down in the comments. I'm very interested to know, do you truly believe that communism can be done correctly? Because everything that I've ever read in history books or in books such as the Gulag Archipelago argue that communism requires totalitarianism, and totalitarianism eventually leads to the persecution of the society. If there's anything that we've learned from George Orwell, it's that we should completely avoid totalitarian governments. So as far as I'm concerned, there is not a right way to do it, and that we are extremely blessed to live in the country with the freedoms that we have currently. But let me know down in the comments. Very interested to know what you think, because this book to me was a very, very good reminder of how blessed we are and how we need to be protecting our freedoms at all costs. If you'd like to hear the full review of this book, make sure to check out this episode of the podcast, and make sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so that you'll be notified next time an episode comes out. Thanks for listening.